Hi, everybody. Welcome in. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to join, and then we'll get started. Hi, folks. If you're just joining, we're just giving folks a couple of additional minutes to get into the webinar before we get started in a minute or so. Thanks for joining. All right. Folks are still trickling in, but I think we can get started to go through some of the introductory slides as more folks join. So thank you everybody for joining RMI's webinar titled Embodied Carbon in Scope 3 Climate Disclosure, a Real Estate Perspective. We're really excited that you're here today with us. A brief overview of our objectives for today's session. We're going to provide an introduction to embodied carbon and how it fits into corporate Scope 3 climate disclosure. We also want to provide an overview on the motivations for why real estate should be reporting Scope 3 emissions. We'll then dive into some strategies on portfolio-wide embodied carbon accounting. And then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion to gain some market insights on the current state of practice on embodied carbon in real estate. We have an esteemed panel of speakers here today. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Anish Chalak. I'm a manager in the Carbon-Free Buildings program at RMI, and I work on our Embodied Carbon Initiative. I'm joined today by Stacy Smedley, who is the Executive Director of Building Transparency. Building Transparency is a nonprofit organization dedicated to decarbonizing the construction industry, and Stacy leads the development and scaling of the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, or EC3, which is a groundbreaking software that helps reduce the carbon footprint of building materials. We also have Becca Timms, who is the Director of ESG at Jamestown LP. She leads the environmental, social, and governance initiatives through the Jamestown Green Program. And we're also joined by Kara Kokernak, who is a Senior Director at the ULI Lewis Center for Sustainability in Real Estate. And she leads the decarbonization and net zero thought leadership in that group. Her current focus is on ULI's net zero mission priority, which is sort of a journey to zero, and the relevant work streams around the real estate value chain for tenants, utilities, and embodied carbon. So our agenda today will go through a presentation for the first 30 minutes to introduce the topic of how embodied carbon fits into Scope 3 climate disclosure. And then we'll shift into more of a discussion with some of the real estate panelists to provide the current market status and progress on embodied carbon reporting in Scope 3. And we'll end with some Q&A. There'll be plenty of time for that from the audience, but along the way, if you have any questions or concerns, please just use the Q&A function, and one of our staff will respond to those. And then if it requires a longer response, we will follow up towards the end of the hour. So with that, I wanted to provide just a brief introduction to RMI if you're not familiar with our organization and our Embodied Carbon Initiative. So our group is seeking to create a zero embodied carbon building sector through three levers of change. The first being policy and increasing demand for low carbon building materials through policy. The second being construction and supporting home builders and commercial real estate build with low carbon materials. We know this is an emerging topic, and we're here to support practitioners as they join the fold to use low carbon building materials. And the third is increasing investment, so providing economic value and accelerating corporate investment in low carbon construction. So that's just a bit of background about our organization and team. I'll hand it over briefly to my colleague, Chris Magwood, who leads our Home Builders CAN working group. So just give you a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, thanks, Anish, and welcome everybody. I'm just here on behalf of RMI's Home Builders CAN program, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. We are working with home builders across the US on helping to advocate for alignment on things like ESG reporting and Scope 3 emissions reporting. And so we're just really glad to be welcoming some of our home builder members today and bringing that group into this discussion. So over to you again, Anish.
Thanks, Chris. So let's dive into some of the content for today. We're going to start with a primer on Scope 3 climate disclosure, sort of the introduction to what does that mean if you're starting on the ground floor with this topic. So broadly speaking, when we use the term climate disclosure, we're talking about two pieces of reporting from businesses. One is on climate impacts. So how am I contributing to climate change? The second being climate transition risks and opportunities. This is more about how climate change will impact my business, its operations, profitability, things like that. Today, we're focused on the first piece of that, the climate impacts piece, and understanding how home builders and the real estate industry contribute to climate change. And a key driver of this is that investors and regulators are increasingly looking for climate-aligned business practices and are pushing for more reporting from businesses to understand those impacts. When we think about climate impacts, there's a wide field of emissions impacts, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has provided a framework for us to digest those impacts and report on them. So many folks are already familiar with this, but as background, there are three scopes of emissions that are diagrammed on this chart here. So scope 1 is direct emissions occurring from the company itself. So things like natural gas combustion in a building or fuel used in a company vehicle. So things that a company has direct control over. Scope 2 is indirect purchased energy. So emissions resulting from purchased electricity, steam, etc. And what we're here to talk about today is Scope 3, the third bucket of indirect emissions that covers all of the upstream and downstream activities from business activity. And for the real estate industry, we've highlighted a few key categories to focus on as you think about Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions cover purchased goods that are being purchased for business activities, capital goods, business travel, employee commuting. Downstream, if you own built assets and you're leasing them, the emissions from tenant operational emissions would be considered Scope 3 category emission. Emissions from tenant fit outs and lease spaces as well. Waste generated in operations, and end of life of treatment of sold products. So this is a broader list of Scope 3 emissions categories to get yourself familiar with what is covered under this broad umbrella. But narrowing in on the topic of hand for today, embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is really the emissions from building materials, manufacturing, construction, maintenance, and disposal. So for the real estate industry, this is all the construction materials, practices going into transporting those materials to site, maintaining them, and then ultimately demolishing them. It does exclude operational energy emissions because unless they're for leased assets, because that falls under scope 1 and 2. And so going back to that broader list of scope 3 emissions categories, what we're really focused on today is a subset of these. We're looking at purchased goods, capital goods, leased assets or tenant fit outs for leased assets. And then those are sort of the primary impacts for embodied carbon, and secondary highlighted in the orange color are end-of-life impacts. So there are certainly considerations with construction waste and the demolition of existing structures and estimated end-of-life impacts from a new construction project that should be considered as well. But the highlighted section in red, purchased goods and capital goods, are really the main area of focus. So with all that background, why should you care about embodied carbon? Well, tackling embodied carbon is critical to getting ahead of future emissions. According to the IEA and Architecture 2030, by 2050, embodied carbon will account for almost half of the total carbon emissions from global new construction. So this is a major impact at scale. You can see that over the next 25 years, 51% of emissions from new construction are coming from the operational carbon associated with those buildings, and 49% is from embodied carbon. So this is not an environmental impact that we can afford to ignore, and it's an important one that the real estate industry has a lot of control to impact change. So that's at the global scale, but for the real estate sector and drilling into those scope 3 impacts that we just shared, how much does embodied carbon comprise that bigger scope 3 bucket? And you can see here on this pie chart, scope 1, 2, and remaining scope 3 categories is about 16%. Downstream leased assets, so the emissions from a tenant space, is about 25%. And really the rest of this chart, purchased goods and services and capital goods, are relating to procurement of materials. Some of that might be things like office supplies, sure, vehicles, company vehicles, things like that. But capital goods for the real estate industry are really the building materials used for construction. And so this is up to 49% of the real estate sector's scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions impact. And so it's a major category. And with the advancement of regulations and investors voluntarily seeking this information, it's no longer a segment that can be ignored. So regulatory bodies are moving towards standardizing ESG disclosures and asking for more robust accounting and reporting from businesses. So this is just a slew of news that has come out in the last year or so from different countries and regions, including here in the United States with the SEC adopting climate disclosure rules. Now we know that rule excluded scope 3 emissions today, but it's certainly now in the cards that at a future date, scope 3 could be required nationally. In subregions, we do have scope 3 reporting rules coming out. So in the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, requires Scope 3 emissions reporting. And in California, SB 253, which passed in the last legislative cycle, will require companies with revenues exceeding 1 billion to report Scope 3 emissions starting in 2027. So you can see this policy and regulatory momentum pushing the industry forward to better accounting when it comes to Scope 3 emissions. On the investor side of things, voluntary requests for Scope 3 emissions are growing. So you can see this from a few major entities in the investment space, looking and asking for Scope 3 disclosures from companies that they invest in. So there are these major drivers that are pushing for change. But climate disclosure also has the potential to create value for the company itself. So when we talk about climate disclosure, it's about reporting. But when you report, you also understand what the impacts are, which enables you to invest in areas to decrease climate impact and increase asset value, and then ultimately implement sustainable design and construction practices. So this is a virtuous cycle of data measurement and then investment and emissions reduction. So we do think that climate disclosure is worthwhile beyond just the requests from regulators or investors. We think it's good for business as well. And finally, for this portion, I wanted to just highlight a few international standards and methodologies that are worth referencing. These are sort of the foundation for climate disclosure. It's a bit of an alphabet soup, so forgive me. These slides will be available. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which we mentioned earlier, sets up the framework for categorizing emissions. We have the Climate Disclosure Project, which offers framework for reporting environmental and climate impacts. We have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which provides some industry-specific reporting standards. And then the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which gets more into that second part of climate disclosure, which was mentioned up top about financial risks and opportunities. So I wanted to provide that background for you all before we get into some of the meat on how the accounting actually works for embodied carbon in Scope 3 climate disclosure. So with that, I will pass it to Stacy to get into some of the details on the accounting piece.
Great, thanks. And you're probably going to see a couple of slides that are looking at the same kind of information that Nish just went over. I would say that this stuff is so technical and there's so many definitions and scopes that you have to understand. It's always good to see things more than once. So I'm starting here with just my attempts to, when I was digging into this and trying to first figure out what are these scopes of emissions, and when I was in my role at Skanska, how do we start to look at Scope 3? This is the graphic that I came up with just to try to wrap my head around when we're in that Scope 3 bucket on the right. What are those things and those activities in the construction space, the embodied carbon space of construction that we're really talking about? So again, Scope 1 and 2 are the things that are owned and energy consumption, and then Scope 3 is everything else. And then you can see here my little cartoon diagrams of all the different kind of places along construction material value chain where embodied carbon emissions are within that Scope 3 bucket. Next slide, Anish. I try to just do it myself. So the other thing that has happened and what really, pushed me to really figure out how embodied carbon fit into all of this is that more and more major companies, whether it's a construction company like Skanska that actually builds the buildings, or whether it's an owner like Microsoft or someone like Amazon or others that are working in buildings and development, are making outward commitments, including Scope 3. And they were doing that really before they really understood how big of the impact was. So as reporting is beginning, even though it's really imperfect, which I'll talk a little bit more about, Scope 3 reporting is happening, these companies are finding that that Scope 3 emissions bucket, where all of those embodied carbon emissions live, are over 90% of their total carbon footprint. So if they're making zero carbon commitments, including Scope 3, there is an urgent focus on how to get to the right data to actually prove that you're reducing carbon emissions of the things that you're purchasing, including construction materials. So where we are today, on the left is historically how Scope 3 accounting has been done for purchased goods and capital goods, where you are looking at the money spent on something, whether it's concrete or whatever else you are buying, and you're using an average emissions factor to do the math. So the more you spend on construction products times that average emissions factor, the higher number you get as a result. And when it was just for disclosure and reporting and people weren't thinking about how to prove reduction, that worked imperfectly. But now if you can imagine a company like a Microsoft or a Skanska that wants to invest in a lower carbon concrete in their project, and they purchase that lower carbon concrete at a premium, they are paying more for it. Therefore, their Scope 3 accounting emissions numbers are going to actually go up, even though their realized carbon emissions went down. So there is a move now to try to figure out how we can really look at carbon emissions as an accounting mechanism and carbon as a currency. Or just like we do with cost to get to true cost of a construction project, we can take the quantity of a material purchased times the actual emissions it took to make it to get to an actual emissions accounting for Scope 3 reporting. So again, there's a hybrid mix of this I'll get into in just a second. But really that's kind of current state versus future state from the gray to the blue. Next slide. And understanding environmental product declarations is really important in this whole conversation because EPDs are really that mechanism that give us that carbon currency value that is accurate and product specific to do that accounting math. So EPDs are third-party verified, publicly available, and product-specific environmental impact nutrition labels for products that give you a carbon intensity value per unit that you can then multiply by the amount of the material that you have. And the construction sector is really where this has taken hold based on disclosure requirements for things like the LEED rating system. Now EPDs have become the mechanism for this accurate Scope 3 accounting. Next slide. And just to go back into that kind of scope of embodied carbon emissions that Anish had a slide for, I wanted to put this through the lens of where EPDs really play and how you do this tracking across that embodied carbon life cycle. And I'm sorry for hearing my dog ring the bell in the background. We have a puppy. But on the left, you're seeing the cradle to gate emissions are the emissions of really manufacturing the product, the thing that you know and can control at time of procurement and selection. And that is consistently included and required in EPDs and the standards that dictate them. The construction emissions of how you transport those products to a site and install them can be tracked accurately during that construction stage. Then everything else during the use phase of replacement and end of life is predicted at that time of specification and procurement, but can become realized in actual if you follow that reporting cycle through the life of the building. Next slide. And just a little bit about where we are today. It's exciting to see the standards moving to realize Scope 3 accounting. This is looking at the greenhouse gas protocol, the link. I think Anish should put the link in the resources. I had it on the slide before. But this is looking at their guidance for calculating Scope 3 emissions, the current guidance. What we're seeing here is them explaining that calculation method in terms of specificity, kind of best to worst, and accuracy. So this is a really good kind of graphic to have if you're trying to understand the different types of data you could use to report and how accurate that's going to get you in terms of results. Next slide. Also in this guidance, there is a decision tree that's actually pretty helpful if you are trying to figure out how to do this accounting for the first time to help you understand the types of data you can or should use based on what's available to you today. Next slide. And then just on top of that, the SBTI put out new criteria for the assessment methods in March of this year. This is just a screenshot of what they say in terms of Scope 3 accounting for purchased goods and services. And this is where you can see that they're referencing those greenhouse gas protocol standards that I just showed you. So they're starting to align and reference each other and move again towards that realized accounting method that we all need to if we're really going to say improve that we're decarbonizing the materials that we're procuring. Next slide. The last thing is really the role of EPDs and how this all plays out. So this is a slide that's just showing on the left really where we are today in terms of proprietary methods and data sets that go into accounting platforms that are mushing together spend and actual accounting approaches, then get to scope the results that then go into these reporting platforms in a way that doesn't allow comparability or consistency. On the right is really where building transparency has ended up playing a role in that ability to create a database of verified environmental product declarations that go into our tool, which is free, where you can do comparison and selection reporting to get to scope the results. But really the next slide is the end game, where EPD data, you can click next, Anish. This EPD data can flow and is flowing into multiple accounting platforms via an open API to allow it to be used for that, again, quantity times EPD carbon intensity value for products that you're purchasing. So the whole goal is to make this aligned and harmonized. So no matter where you are, you can leverage this EPD data to do this accounting, know it's comparable to the next person in whatever tool that you're using, and eventually get to the fact where we have really aligned data and we can say that we've decarbonized emissions at this scale. Next slide. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Casey. We're going to get into a little bit on how to get started with that realized emissions or mass-based emissions accounting compared to the status quo, which, as Stacey mentioned, is more of a spend-based calculation. So this part of the presentation is intended to help you get started on your journey to more accurate embodied emissions accounting for your corporate climate disclosure. So two sections for us to focus on now are, one is scoping boundaries for your embodied emissions accounting, and the second, prioritizing material categories where you will get EPDs and kind of start your journey with using EPDs and mass-based emissions accounting for embodied emissions, because there's a ton of different types of materials that are used in construction projects, and we know that it's challenging to day one account for all of them using the EPD approach, but there are certainly major categories to focus on. So when it comes to scoping boundaries, we also want to acknowledge that there are different types of businesses in the real estate industry. And so we'll provide some guidance on scoping boundaries for different types of real estate activities. So starting with the building developer, investor, or first owner for a new construction project, these are typically major projects. There's a lot going into the project. So we're looking at a more holistic embodied emissions accounting for this type of project. And so to orient you to this slide, we're looking at the bottom at the different life cycle stages. So A1 through A3 is what is captured in an EPD for a specific material. A4 and A5 is realized and measured at the construction site based on transportation to site and the activities on the site itself. And then end of life, in this instance, is looking at actual emissions from demolished structures. So this is more of the construction waste piece of it. And so this is to say that if you're building a new project, these sections that are highlighted in red are the ones to really focus on for calculating that embodied impact and translating it to an annual corporate climate disclosure report. For a new construction project, we know that there's also the hypothetical measurement of what the end of life impact of the disposal of all the materials that are going into that construction project are. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol actually has a Scope 3 category for that. It's end of life treatment of sold products. So we do recommend that when you're doing this embodied carbon accounting during the new construction design process, that you do track the estimated end of life emissions for those materials. And where that really becomes important is at the point of sale. So the guidance from Greenhouse Gas Protocol is when you're selling a product, you incur the estimated end of life impacts of those sold products, because those are no longer in your control, and they could end up in a landfill tomorrow. So the idea here is that you're doing actual accounting with EPDs for the product phase, construction phase, and then demolition of structures on site, which is very measurable, in your control. You're estimating then the end of life for those new materials to see what happens, and incurring that impact when you sell the asset. So we do recommend whole building life cycle assessment with product specific EPDs as a way to have this holistic accounting for new construction projects, which then enables you to kind of pick out the A1 through A5 section, the demolished impacts, and the estimated end of life impacts, and use those for your climate reporting. So these are the most complex types of projects and require the most robust accounting. But we know that there's other types of real estate activities. So another being an existing building owner. How do I think about embodied carbon? This is typically from the renovation and maintenance of the building. And there's two types of spaces. If you're an existing building owner, there's spaces that you control. Maybe that's common areas or certain parts of the building that you don't lease out. And then there's leased spaces. So in the diagram here, the yellow is the controlled spaces, red is on the bottom is the leased spaces. So for spaces that you as the owner can control, we recommend that you account for the materials that are going into renovating those controlled spaces. So A1 through A3, collecting EPDs, and then measuring as well the transportation and construction impacts associated with those renovation projects. For the downstream leased piece, you have less control over that, but we do recommend working with tenants on tenant fit out projects to account for A1 through A3 impacts, just so there's sort of this cooperation across the whole real estate value chain on how to address embodied impacts. So this is for the existing building owner and that renovation and maintenance piece. And if you're a tenant, you can only control your tenant fit out project. And so in that instance, really focusing in on the project you're doing and collecting EPDs for the materials that are being used in your tenant fit out projects. So the second piece, once we are past scoping, is material categories. So as we mentioned previously, there's a lot of different materials, and getting started requires thinking about these more discreetly and focusing on priority materials. So to get started, we recommend disclosing the bare minimum, so calculating material quantities for high impact materials, high volume materials that are being purchased as part of the project, and really looking at product specific EPDs for a set of materials. So we're calling them category 1 materials, and I'll show you on the next slide what we're calling a category 1 material. So materials like concrete, structural steel, thermal insulation, concrete masonry units, asphalt, glass. These are materials that are purchased in high volumes for projects. They typically account for the majority of embodied emissions impacts from projects. So starting with this subset of materials makes a lot of sense when it comes to moving towards this mass-based accounting where you're calculating material quantities, getting product-specific EPDs for those, and getting a true measurement of your embodied carbon impact. If you're more sophisticated, we recommend then taking industry-wide EPDs for the category 2 materials that were on the previous slide. So you start with those high volume materials, and then you move into additional material categories and start with looking at industry-wide EPDs for those material categories, just to have some benchmark and understanding of what the embodied carbon impact is. And this will enable you to have some level of baselining, so you can start to track reductions relative to where you started. Once you have gone through this process of getting product-specific EPDs for the major and high-impact materials, industry-wide EPDs for the second category of materials, start to look at product-specific EPDs for a wider set of materials. So moving the needle over and getting more product-specific EPDs, getting better accounting for your projects. Ultimately, the goal is to achieve full mass-based disclosure using product-specific EPDs. But we know that's not feasible day one, but this is just to sort of provide you with that vision for what this will look like down the road. And here are just some strategies for how to reduce embodied carbon with material selection, efficient design, reuse and recycling, and innovating in the construction process. And if you're someone who is developing new projects, new construction projects, these can be captured as part of the scoping boundaries of that were recommended for new construction projects. And with that, I will move forward to just the recommendation before we enter our panel discussion, which is start embracing assessments. Require embodied carbon assessments in all new building and adaptive reuse projects so that you can get started on this journey. Sustainable procurement. So start with the mass-based low embodied carbon material procurement and tracking practices, specifically for those high volume category 1 materials, such as concrete, steel, etc. And then for new construction projects, conduct whole building life cycle assessments with product-specific EPDs documented, so you know what's going in your project. So you get the full scope of embodied carbon impacts, and you can pull from those as you do your annual climate disclosure. So with that, we can move to our discussion portion for the rest of our time together. And yeah, I think we can bring Kara and Becca on and just have a few reflections on how the real estate industry is really addressing embodied carbon today. So maybe we can get started with Kara. I know ULI has been hosting convenings with real estate stakeholders on the topic of embodied carbon. Could you tell us more about those, provide a little bit of background on ULI's work in this space, and then maybe a specific question just on motivations for why you're seeing real estate stakeholders starting to care about embodied carbon?
Sure. Thank you, Anish. And thank you for a great overview, Stacy. This has been great. And I do have slides we can go through, but a lot of it has already been covered in the discussion today. So we can keep skipping through slides here. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Land Institute, our overall mission is to shape the future of the built environment for impacting communities worldwide. So things like embodied carbon are really becoming an important factor for real estate, because if you flip to the next slide, Anish, it's something that we discussed a couple times. Next slide. Keep going. This one. It's a big piece of the pie. So we've already talked about that a little bit. So this is global CO2 emissions by sector. You've got your building operations at 28%, and then your building materials and construction at 11%. And that's global CO2 emissions. So real estate really has a responsibility to address embodied carbon as well as building operations. And if you flip to the next slide, I love this chart because this chart shows that for every square meter, and this is for office buildings, constructed in the US, it will take about 19 years for carbon emissions from daily operations to catch up with those from the construction of the core and shell of a building. That's huge. And then so those numbers, if you're looking at the chart, operational carbon is blue, and then core and shell is yellow. If you add in the impacts from interior fit outs, that's that red line there. The time required for operational emissions to catch up with embodied carbon or embodied emissions doubles, stretching to 37 years. So it shows that for certain sectors like office or commercial buildings, the impact from interior construction is more significant than core and shell when considered over the life of a building. So not only do we need to care about embodied carbon and the emissions associated with the building and transportation of materials when a building goes up, we have to think about renovations, and initially, like you mentioned, we have to think about the tenants. We have to think about the tenant fit outs and the folks that are using the buildings. So real estate across different asset classes are really taking embodied carbon into consideration. So yes, we have held a few embodied carbon convenings, and you can flip back to that slide that kind of gives a quick overview of them. We have held so far 2 embodied carbon convenings for cross-sector leaders. Our first one was in January in 2023, where we just brought together executives from construction firms and developer firms just to talk about embodied carbon. And the best part was, I'd say, when we did a round robin, is some people said, I don't know what embodied carbon is. So this was over a year ago, and that has changed significantly. So that's the reason we held that first one, just to get those folks at the high level talking about embodied carbon reductions. Our second one we held in September of 2023, where we invited the suppliers to the table. So we invited concrete and steel suppliers, along with our construction and developer folks, to talk about, what levers to pull. How can concrete and steel provide more materials or more options? Is it because they do or don't have EPDs that aren't being used? Is it a local or regional issue? So really just getting folks together and talking about how they can work together and talk to each other. And now we have our third convening happening in June of this year, where we have invited our architects and our engineers to the table. So we're really excited for that to come up. If you're interested in attending, we do have a few spots left. So if you are an architect or engineer and want to be pulled into the embodied carbon conversation, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can make room for you. But it's really exciting to see that the progression we've had in just, a year and a half on what folks are doing around embodied carbon and how their goals and strategies have changed. We can move on. I know we've already covered these slides. We can talk a little bit about gaps and opportunities in current disclosure practices. We've talked about this a little bit already today, but this is a really quick overview of what's happening in terms of policy. So that image on the left there shows the policy landscape, and those dark yellow ones are states where legislation has passed in terms of embodied carbon and Scope 3 emissions accounting. And then the light yellow is where they have been introduced. And then the image on the right there shows the current US and Canada embodied carbon policies for new construction. The red is a national policy. The yellow again is that state policy that you also see reflected in the left image. And then blue is local policy. So if you go to the next slide, it's really tricky. There's a lot of policies coming out. There's a lot to take account of. Folks are saying, well, what is this federal, state, and local carbon policy? How does it interact with our operational benchmarking ordinances we're already familiar with or not so familiar with, or our net zero building codes? So we've got embodied carbon policies that look like procurement policies, buy clean and material specific. We've got climate action plans, building codes, or other types of city zoning and land use incentives or regulations. And really, it's a practice of identifying those gaps and opportunities in current disclosure practices and putting them into place where you are building or existing in a building. And next slide, please. We have seen some great product innovations in leadership in low carbon development. We talked a little bit about product innovations, and Stacy, you brought up, EPDs, and it's great to see that has been more popular, and we had folks at our convening talk about getting new EPDs and the process becoming easier the more and more that you do it, and that is always great to hear. But we hear about innovations in concrete mixes, reducing embodied carbon. We've heard of, concrete add-ins, different types of chemical add-ins that reduce embodied carbon. There's, in terms of steel, reducing embodied carbon in steel. Steel is one of the most recycled building materials in the world, but you can reduce the embodied carbon by looking at the manufacturing side of things. So how is that steel manufacturing plant powered? Is it an electric powered plant? Is it a coal-fired plant? And getting those newer and more efficient plants up and running are really a key step for the steel industry. Electric powered construction vehicles. That's another one that I think is often overlooked. Making sure that folks know that there's options, know that they can bring these electric powered construction vehicles on their site. And then on the flip side, there are very important grant and loan programs at the U.S. Department of Energy and EPA, evaluating these innovative products, making sure they get those EPDs out there and get them listed for you to take a look at. And there's a few other great innovations where there's been a performance-based buyers alliance formed to teach other buyers how to specify low carbon concrete. So you all are not alone. So there's folks that have been doing this for a while, like Stacy and like Becca out there, that can say, hey, here's a reference guide. Here's a buyers alliance that gives you the steps on how to do this in your project or your building. So we've seen a lot of innovations on both policy side and materials side.
Thanks,
And
Sarah.
then, yeah, great.
That was really helpful, and I also wanted to kind of reiterate the point you made about the policy landscape, like advancing pretty considerably in the last couple of years. And we know that can seem confusing, and then we're like layering on this climate disclosure piece onto this. But the idea here is that the fundamental data source for all of this, the EPD and the accounting methodologies, are all the same. And you're going to use this information in different ways, whether that's for policy compliance or to disclose your emissions to investors or regulators. But if you move towards this mass-based accounting system, the accounting is the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a couple examples, but Becca is also a member of the Urban Land Institute and has great examples from Jamestown. So I will pass it to her to talk about what Jamestown is doing.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would love to hear, Becca, from your experience at Jamestown, where you are on the embodied carbon journey, and maybe you could touch on some of the case studies that you've been working on.
Yeah, happy to. And this has been fantastic. I've been taking vigorous notes. And I would say, despite being up here talking about where we are, this is really an ecosystem approach. I mean, we've heard about sector alignment even from Chris. I think learning from each other is so important. I also say, just to reiterate that last point, you can run, but you can't hide. But it's not that bad. And so hopefully I can walk through a couple of examples. Jamestown is a vertically integrated real estate developer. We've got about 11.6 billion in assets under management, but we're a design-focused real estate firm. And so we're getting really to the heart of some of the key things that Jamestown cares about in terms of how we build and redevelop buildings and then operate existing buildings. You can go to the next slide. This is where we operate. And so, even thinking back to some of those European directives, California state law, both as it impacts Jamestown as an entity, but also our investors, our tenants. That's where I kind of joke with you can run, but you can't hide. Even laws that don't necessarily cover Jamestown as an owner and developer are often things that our tenants and other stakeholders care a lot about. So there's a lot of motivation to get moving on embodied carbon and Scope 3 emissions. You can go to the next slide. To contextualize this in the space of our overall ESG program, we have 9 ESG impact areas, and like many companies, are part of a number of external groups, and we have targets. Emissions from embodied carbon, we really started with this current set of targets by saying our goal is to be able to track embodied carbon. That's where we started, back to the old, you can't manage what you don't measure. We're actually resetting our targets this year. And so one of the big focuses will be, where are we now with embodied carbon? And how can we actually set some measurable targets based on what we've learned so far? I also think that critically important is the why it matters. Why are we doing this? What are the levers that it has to pull? And I think I've already reviewed a couple of those. But really tying it back to, driving NOI and value creation, which, as an investor and a fiduciary, that is our core responsibility. And so as we move through some of these early pilots, we're very focused on the economics and even some of those other impacts in terms of leasability and how our tenants are responding. And to date, that's been pretty positive, and we expect it to increase. You can go to the next slide. I want to get to the case study. I do co-lead an innovation and sustainability team, and we focus a lot on technology. But again, I think, there's a whole category of technology, from EC3 to other tools that are really critical in getting this measurement completed, but also doing it in a cost-effective way. One of our big things when it comes to innovation is it should be delightful and frictionless. We try to take the burden of a lot of kind of the learning, but you can go to the next slide. It's something that we're thinking about as we talk about embodied carbon. You can go on and skip 2 slides ahead. We've talked about a lot of this. We focus a lot on existing building net zero, and we talked about the impact of retrofits. I thought that slide was so interesting. But to move on to our main embodied carbon case study, this is 619 Ponce. It's the building on the street corner there. It is a 4-story mass timber loft office building being constructed in Atlanta, Georgia. As you can see, it's on a infill site next to an adaptive reuse project, which was the first phase. But it's got about 87,000 square feet of office, 27,000 square feet of retail. And we're very proud to be able to use regional mass timber to construct this building. So we did a whole building life cycle assessment and have really kind of dug in on the numbers. So this is the first building that we've really taken this regional mass timber approach. And we're excited to be able to do this using trees that are actually grown in forests that Jamestown owns and manages, which was really cool for us. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, you're right on, Kara, that of course we're all showing a lot of, similar graphics. But, Stacy, even the one that you created, I feel like at this point we're all carbon translators. And so, taking this highly technical information and, translating it into an audience that doesn't live in this space every day, I think, is a really big focus of mine. But for 619 Ponce, we really focused on the construction materials and the construction process. We plan to do a lot more in the future, but that's what these numbers focus on. You can go to the next slide. This is just a kind of an angle of the building, and we're talking about the mass timber because that is one of the main features of this project. But we also really wanted to prioritize human health, and so this project is pursuing LEED Core and Shell as well as Fitwel certification. It's a nearly all-electric building. We did some gas service for emergency power and maybe a restaurant space, but it's nearly all electric. And we also used a material flow chart to make decisions really for the high-touch elements. We decided to focus on those high-touch elements because we wanted to kind of strike that right balance between, the metrics that really mattered. So that led to, both our decision to do mass timber, but also other things like, windows, other types of covering, and other elements of the design. You can go to the next slide. These are just some fun pictures of the process. Again, everyone from our internal team to the contractors, J.E. Dunn, Structure Craft, who put the mass timber together, and even Georgia Pacific that helped us at the mill stage. This was, truly an integrated project approach, and the whole building and the mass timber elements were really designed for the full life cycle approach. You can go to the next slide. And so when you're in the space, you can see all of the different elements of this. I think what this really highlights is like, you know, within this highly technical piece of our work, the story is still really important. You know, I think that the motivations and, you know, what people connect with is being in this space. It's not necessarily the embodied carbon charts at the end of the day, but that's our job, right? And so I think, you know, what's really cool is now that the building is, we just cut the ribbon on it a couple weeks ago, you know, being able to see people interact with the space. And it's been really, the reception has been great. You can go to the next slide. So these are a little bit of the numbers. So in this case, StructureCraft completed an LCA, which was really meant to highlight the difference of the carbon emissions from a gravity system, a traditional concrete gravity system, which is really beams, columns, and floors, compared to a mass timber design. We also looked at Austrian timber and Pacific Northwest timber. Because if we were truly just focusing on cost, our decision might have led us to source this from another region. And you know, based on the final LCA, our design had almost a 75% reduction in embodied carbon emissions compared to that concrete gravity system. There's certainly other aspects of the building that we did not measure, you know, all of the interior selections and things like that. But the point of this project was really to explore the benefits of mass timber. So we're taking what we've learned, even things like that material selection flowchart, and we've already been applying these processes to other projects like overbuilds and even some TI. All right, and the last thing that I have, and I know we have a couple more questions, hopefully we have time for them, is just how to build a portfolio strategy. I think leaning in on the projects where you know you've got a lot of attention and have the support to the extent that there may be extra cost. I think that's always a great place to start. But the other thing that I always mention, and I think it was brought up earlier, is, you know, oftentimes asking the question is free. Scoping the work, getting the LCA priced out. You know, I think there's a lot that can be done just by, you know, raising awareness and asking the questions. And certainly the financial decisions can follow. But I'll stop there and hopefully we've got time for a couple more questions. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Becca. I know we're short on time to answer everyone's Q&As. I know we've been answering a lot of them, and we can, you know, share out some of the kind of bigger questions as a follow-up to this. As a last question that I would just throw, maybe just like a 30-second response from Becca, you, and Stacy. I'm curious how you think we can make it easier for real estate firms to report embodied carbon at the portfolio level. Like, what would make your life easier, essentially?
I think data availability is just key. You know, having EPDs available. The other thing I like to do is to look at, you know, other materials that we're purchasing already, and using information we have to show, you know, what we're already doing. For example, what is the impact of our current materials? So, you know, I think a lot of it is just transparency around what that measurement is, what's needed, and then what it costs. Thanks.
Stacey, do you have an idea of what would make it easier for real estate firms to?
Yeah, I mean, we're that's really what we are here trying to do at building transparency. So I think we will continue to try to provide the EPD data in an open, accessible way. And I think what I'm seeing is that the need and the necessity for there to be more and more platforms that enable the accounting to happen. There's not going to be a one size fits all or a one platform or one tool that fits all. But if the data can stay consistent and we can trust in the data, you know, we need beams and EC3s and even the for-profit tools that are getting funding to build their databases and tools like Tangible. We just need a proliferation of tools so people can meet this where they are and use the tool that best works for them.
Awesome, thanks. Well, to close out today, the slide on the screen now are just a few resources from Kara's team at ULI. So it'll be in the deck when we share it out, but if you want, you can use the QR codes to get access to those. And I know there's an upcoming resource from ULI as well. Kara had to drop, but she wanted to let everybody know that there's an upcoming resource on intervention points for including embodied carbon measurement and reduction in real estate. So if we were to leave you with some salient points, one of them is it's time for action. We'd love to harness the momentum that's happening in the embodied carbon space now. As Stacy mentioned, there's tools available. There's more data that is becoming available with EPA grants. There will be even more. Getting into consistent reporting across the portfolio for your firm, and then finally, we'll look at unlocking opportunities for financial value through climate disclosure. So thank you for your time. If you want to reach out to us, we'll follow up with our contact information to attendees. But thank you for attending, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.